Welcome back for another deep dive with us. You know that feeling when you're totally fired up about an idea,
Oh, yeah.
but then you're kind of like, okay, now what? Where do I even start?
Right. The inspiration is there. It's
Exactly.
turning it into something real.
Totally. Well, that's exactly what we're tackling in this deep dive.
Okay.
We're dissecting a motivational podcast episode called Get This, Dream Big, Work Hard, Make It Happen.
Straight to the point, huh?
No kidding. But honestly, sometimes you just need that reminder,
For sure.
Like, yeah, dream big, obviously, but then how?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I gotta say, this episode actually does get into the how, which I appreciated.
Okay, so it's not just fluffy feel-good stuff.
Not at all. It lays out a framework, some actual steps you can take.
All right, I'm intrigued. Hit me with the first building block.
Well, they start with the importance of having that big picture vision.
Yeah.
Even if you're swamped with day-to-day tasks, knowing where you ultimately want to go is essential.
Like if you jumped in your car and just started driving with no destination in mind,
Oh, yeah.
you'd probably end up lost.
Exactly. And the host of the podcast, she actually shares a personal story about this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She realized she was so focused on just getting things done that she hadn't really taken the time to think about like what she actually wanted to achieve over the next few years.
Wow, I feel that.
Right. So she decided to step back and define her bigger picture, and it sounds like that was a total game changer for her.
Okay, so how'd she do that? Did she, like, make a vision board or something?
She actually used a few different methods. She started with some serious reflection on her values, like what truly mattered to her most.
Okay.
Then she brainstormed, just letting all these ideas flow about things she wanted to experience, achieve, both personally and professionally.
So it wasn't just about work goals, it was like a holistic picture.
Exactly. And then to top it off, she created like a visual representation of her ideal future.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it's like a vision board, but also kind of like a mind map,
Okay, that's cool. I like that she used multiple approaches. Makes it feel less like, oh, here's the one right way to do this.
Right. Everyone's different.
Totally. But speaking of things that can trip us up, the podcast also talks about this idea of leaving your ego at the door
Oh, yeah.
when it comes to achieving your dreams. I'm curious, what did they mean by that?
Well, they argue that ego can show up in a lot of sneaky ways, not just being arrogant. It can be that fear of failure or not being open to learning new things.
You mean like being stuck in your ways?
Exactly. And that can make you defensive, resistant to feedback, even unkind to yourself and others.
Wow, so it's like ego is actually working against your dreams in those cases.
Exactly. The podcast makes the point that a big ego can actually hold you back from achieving anything truly great.
Because you're too scared to take risks or admit you need help, right?
Right. It basically creates all these roadblocks on your path to growth. So the question is, how do we dismantle those roadblocks? What do they suggest we do?
Yeah, good question.
It starts with being aware,
Yeah.
like really paying attention to when your ego is driving your actions.
Okay, so self-awareness is key.
Totally. And then it's about consciously choosing to act from a place of humility, like being genuinely curious and open to learning.
So it's like shifting from I know it all to I'm here to learn and grow,
Exactly. And speaking of learning, that brings us to the next big point for the podcast.
which is
Never stop learning.
the classic advice. But I'm always up for hearing how different people approach that idea.
Yeah, and they emphasize that achieving big dreams often means stepping outside your comfort zone and picking up some new skills along the way.
I love the example they give about the podcast host herself. She had to learn video editing for a project, and she was totally intimidated at first.
Yeah, but you did it anyway.
It's such a good reminder that we're all capable of learning new things, no matter what our age or background is.
And she talks about how learning that new skill actually helped her overcome some of those ego-driven fears we were just discussing.
Interesting. So it was like stepping outside her comfort zone actually made her more confident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like proof that embracing that beginner's mindset can be incredibly empowering.
All right, so we've got the big picture vision. We're keeping our egos in check. We're committed to learning new things. What's next? What's the final piece of the puzzle here?
Well, it's all about action. Like you can have the most amazing vision, the most humble mindset,
Right.
and all the knowledge in the world. But if you don't actually do anything with it, nothing's going to change.
It's like that saying, A goal without a plan is just a wish or something like that.
Exactly.
But even with a plan, sometimes it's just so hard to get started, you know?
Or absolutely. The podcast even talks about that, like how it's easy to overthink
Oh,
things.
yeah, analysis paralysis.
Yes, or
Yeah.
just straight up procrastination.
Ugh, all too familiar.
So they really stress the importance of breaking those big goals down into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of trying to climb the whole mountain at once, you're looking for those little footholds.
Yeah, those small wins that can get you going.
I like that analogy. Makes it feel less overwhelming.
Right. And they even give this simple little exercise.
Oh, what is it?
They ask you to think about just one tiny action you could take today
Mm-hmm.
to move a little bit closer to your goal. It could be anything, but just something you could do right now.
I love that because it shifts your mindset from like, I'll start tomorrow to what can I do right this second?
Exactly. It's about building that habit of taking action even when it feels kind of scary or inconvenient.
Totally. But you know, what's interesting. The podcast makes the point that taking action, even in those small ways, can actually help you overcome those ego-driven fears we talked about before.
Oh, yeah.
Because when you start seeing progress, even if it's tiny, it kind of boosts your confidence.
It's like that saying, motion creates emotion, right?
I've never heard that, but I like it.
Yeah, and the podcast also acknowledges that it's not always going to be easy. There are going to be bumps in the road.
Oh, for sure. No dream journey is perfectly smooth, right?
Exactly. And that's where the whole work hard part of their title comes in.
Okay, so it's not just about setting goals and taking action.
Right. It's also about resilience and perseverance.
Like that grit factor we hear
Mhm.
so much about.
Exactly. The ability to bounce back from setbacks and keep moving forward no matter what.
So is that something you're either born with or not? Or can you actually develop resilience?
Well, the podcast suggests that resilience is kind of like a muscle.
Okay.
The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
So how do we use our resilience muscle?
One way is to change how we think about challenges.
Instead of seeing them as failures, we should see them as opportunities.
Exactly. The podcast encourages you to look at setbacks as feedback, as valuable data.
Interesting. So not like a personal attack, but information to help you adjust your course.
Right. And that ties back to the ego thing too.
How so?
If you're super attached to being right all the time,
Yeah,
it's hard to see setbacks as anything but failures.
that makes sense. So a little bit of humility actually makes you more resilient.
Exactly. Because then you can admit when you messed up, learn from it, and move on without beating yourself up.
You know, as helpful as all this is, it can still feel really lonely sometimes trying to achieve big dreams.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. And the podcast actually spends a good chunk of time talking about the importance of community.
Okay, so you're not meant to do it all alone.
Definitely not. They emphasize surrounding yourself with people who support you.
Your cheer squad.
Exactly. People who believe in your dreams and challenge you to grow.
It's like finding your tribe, right?
Yeah. And it's not just about receiving support, but also giving it.
Okay, so being part of a community where everyone's lifting each other up.
Exactly. The podcast argues that helping others achieve their goals actually gives your own journey more purpose.
I love that it's not just about you, you know?
Right. It's a beautiful cycle. And speaking of purpose, the podcast also talks about defining success on your own terms.
Oh yeah, that's a big one these days. Not just buying into the whole money and status thing.
Totally. They make the point that true success is about living a life that feels authentic and fulfilling.
So it's about aligning your goals with your values, not just what society tells you is important.
Exactly. The podcast encourages you to figure out what truly matters to you, what brings you joy and a sense of purpose.
And then chase those things, not just external validation.
Right. It's about creating a life that feels good on the inside.
Not just one that looks good on Instagram.
Exactly. But even when you're pursuing goals that feel really meaningful,
Yeah.
there are going to be moments of doubt,
Oh yeah, for sure.
frustration, maybe even fear.
So how do you deal with all that? You just got to power through it.
The podcast talks about the power of self-talk.
Oh, like that little voice in your head.
Yeah. They encourage you to consciously choose positive and empowering thoughts.
So instead of focusing on all the things that could go wrong, you're focusing on what you want to happen.
Exactly. It's about reframing those negative thoughts and replacing limiting beliefs with affirmations.
Like those I am statements.
Yeah, things that support your growth and progress.
So it's like training your brain to focus on possibilities instead of getting stuck in fear.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner cheerleader.
I like that. But it's also important to acknowledge those negative emotions, right? Not just pretend they're not there.
Oh, absolutely. The podcast really emphasizes self-compassion.
Like being kind to yourself even when you mess up.
Exactly. It's about allowing yourself to feel your emotions without judgment.
Because we're all human, we're going to have bad days.
Totally. And sometimes self-care means taking a break, asking for help, or just giving yourself permission to rest.
That's so important. You can't run on empty.
Right. The podcast reminds us that taking care of yourself is essential for achieving your goals.
It's not selfish. It's actually an investment.
Exactly. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Action, resilience, community, defining success on your own terms.
And cultivating a positive mindset.
It's a pretty comprehensive framework for making dreams happen.
It really is. As we wrap up this part, what was the most powerful takeaway for you?
You know what really stuck with me was the emphasis on joy and fulfillment.
Interesting.
Like it's so easy to get caught up in the chase,
Yeah, just focused on the end goal.
Exactly. But the podcast reminds us that the journey matters just as much.
It's about finding those moments of joy even when things are tough.
Yes. And appreciating how far you've come, celebrating the small wins.
It's about making sure the whole process feels aligned with your values.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, isn't that what it's all about?
Couldn't agree more. And that's a perfect segue into our final part where we'll be diving into some practical tips
Oh, cool.
for actually taking those first steps and putting all of this wisdom into action. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture thinking, the ego stuff, the learning, but how do we actually do it? How do we turn these dreams into, reality?
Right. We need the action plan.
Exactly. Give us the goods. What does the podcast say?
Well, one thing they talk about is micro goals.
Oh, okay.
Instead of getting overwhelmed by this huge dream, you break it down into teeny tiny steps.
So instead of, I'm going to write a novel, it's more like, I'm going to write for 15 minutes today.
Exactly. Make it so small you almost can't not do it.
I like that. Lowers the pressure.
Right. And they also talk about this thing called time blocking.
Time blocking.
Yeah, like actually scheduling blocks of time in your calendar,
Okay.
specifically for working into your goals.
So you're treating it like any other important meeting or appointment.
Exactly. Because it is important.
That's a good point. It's about being proactive, not just waiting for free time to magically appear.
Totally. But, even with the best plans, stuff happens.
Oh, yeah. Life loves to throw curveballs.
Right. So the podcast also emphasizes being flexible.
So it's not about sticking to the plan no matter what.
Nope. It's about adapting, revising your goals, maybe even changing direction completely.
Okay, so it's more about the journey than having everything perfectly mapped out in advance.
Exactly. And they encourage you to see those challenges as opportunities.
Not as failures.
Right. Because the truth is the path is rarely ever straight. There are going to be detours and bumps along the way.
Yeah, and sometimes you learn more from those detours than you do from just cruising along.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it all goes back to defining success on your own terms.
Like we talked about before.
It's not just about the end goal. It's about creating a life that feels good, that's aligned with your values.
Right. What really stuck with me from the podcast was that reminder that everyone has something unique to offer the world.
Oh, yeah. I loved that part.
It's so empowering.
Totally. It's like we all have this special gift or talent or perspective.
And when you connect your goals to something bigger than yourself, to making a positive impact, it gives them more meaning.
It's not just about you. It's about contributing something good to the world.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into turning dreams into reality, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I think it's that reminder to never underestimate the power of your dreams.
Okay.
Like no matter how big or small they are, those dreams have the potential to change your life and maybe even the world around you.
So take those first steps, embrace the journey, and let's make some magic happen.
Cheers to that.